Bloomberg Green. And with that, let's get started. We begin with a look at the power of climate law. It is my pleasure to welcome Laura Clark, CEO of Climate Earth, on stage for a conversation with Bloomberg's John Frayer.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. So yesterday we heard a lot about climate finance and how climate finance can be used to protect the natural world. We heard a lot about global climate politics from John Kerry. But one of the most powerful trends in the climate story, I think, is climate litigation. And with me here to talk about this is the new CEO of Climate Earth, Laura Clark. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
You've been in this job now for 2 months. Can you just tell us a little bit about your early impressions?
Yeah, absolutely. So 2 months in, and as you say, Climate Earth use the law to make change. We're here to make change, to tackle climate change, protect nature, stop pollution. And we do that, I think we get most, if people know us, they know us for the litigation wins that we have, but we actually do 3 things. We build capacity, we train prosecutors, work with communities to empower them to look after their environment. We advise and advocate for the right legislation in place, and then we do strategic litigation to hold corporates and governments to account. And it's all about how we can effect that systemic change. So we bring cases that will then set a precedent and will actually change the way governments, corporates operate and the way they think.
And could you perhaps give us a few concrete examples of the kind of work you've done and some of the successes you've had that just sort of give the audience here a sense of the kind of impact that you can have when you're successful?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've a number of cases, particularly we've been very focused recently on, or over the last 5 years, on corporate responsibilities in the climate change space. And so looking at, first of all, advising on what is a 1.5 degrees aligned net zero strategy and what that looks like in terms of really sitting at the heart of a company's operations. But then we hold companies to account when they don't do that. And so we've had a big focus on greenwashing in recent years with our greenwashing files. And so, for example, in 2019, we filed a complaint against BP for its advertising that talked all about its sustainable future and low carbon future, and when in reality 96% of its operations is in fossil fuels. And then as a result of that complaint, BP withdrew their advertising and said they would no longer do reputation type advertising. And we've got a number of other greenwashing cases, and the idea there is to say, we don't want to make the best the enemy of the good. If an organization is genuinely trying to do the right thing, but just getting a few things wrong, because this is hard, right? Then we don't want to be suing companies that are trying to do the right thing and just getting a few things wrong. What we want to do is go after companies that are saying they're doing the right thing, but it's actually just a PR exercise and it's misleading people. And so when you take a greenwashing case like that, it sets an example of a company that's not doing the right thing. It means that others sit up and take notice and change what they do. And we hope to change the behaviors then of corporates and advertising and therefore accelerate the transition to net zero.
And can you just, when you're making those cases, like on greenwashing, what sort of legal arguments are you making? Obviously, when you hold governments to account, obviously you're sort of saying you're not doing the right thing by your citizens.
Yeah.
But when it's companies, can you give us a sense of the flavor of the arguments that you use?
Yeah, and it depends. It depends on the jurisdiction where you're operating, but often through that you'll go through some sort of consumer protection legislation, and so it's about finding the right vehicle for a claim. But as you say, when we're taking governments to account, so we had a win this year against the UK government's net zero strategy, where the High Court ruled on the hottest day of the year, or the hottest day ever in the UK, it ruled that the UK's net zero strategy was not compliant with our 2008 Climate Change Act, because essentially the numbers didn't add up. There was a gap in terms of how they were going to get to the required emissions. When you do that sort of litigation, you've got a clear vehicle. So our vehicle there was the, well, there was clear vehicles, but our vehicle there was the UK Climate Change Act. And again, that the UK's got a very progressive legislation, a very, very progressive climate change architecture, if you like, and a huge number of people trying to do the right thing. And litigation is not always antagonistic, right? It's saying, this is how we think there are gaps and how we can improve what we're trying to do. And a result of that, that win in the High Court, the UK government has said it's going to go away and it's going to improve that net zero strategy, and it's going to do that by March 23.
Mm-hmm. Greenwashing, we've talked about greenwashing, also human rights. I mean, at this COP, I've particularly noticed just how much talk there is about biodiversity, forests, protecting forests, etc. You've been taking some cases recently that focus on human rights and biodiversity. Can you talk a little bit about those?
Well, actually, the one that we're most excited about is human rights and climate change, actually. So I'll talk about that if I can. And that's a very recent, in September, a decision by the UN Human Rights Council that the Australian government's inaction on climate change was a violation of the rights of the indigenous Torres Strait Islanders. And essentially, the Torres Strait Islanders have lived where they live on these low-lying islands for all time, and their complaint was that the Australian government was not doing enough to support them and adapt to the climate change impacts of essentially sea level rise. And Yessi Mosby, who's one of these Torres Strait Islanders who brought the claim, and Client Earth worked with them on it, he's here at COP26, and we had an event with him yesterday where he was talking about the impact of climate change and sea level rise at such a real personal level, whereby one day he was walking along the beach and the bones of his grandmother washed up on the beach because the sea has risen to a level where it's encroaching on the land, it's washing away graves, and particularly in Torres Strait Islander culture, that is the most devastating thing, because when someone passes, you bury them and they need to stay undisturbed. And I think what was extraordinary and so moving about him talking about it is it really brings it home. This is the real life experience of so many people around the world who are dealing with these impacts. And when we can then get a case that says, that actually indigenous people's culture is at risk from climate change, but also that governments have got a duty to their people to support them in dealing with the impacts of climate change, that's really powerful. And it's really powerful also in the context of the conversation of loss and damage. And because the Human Rights Council also ruled that the Australian government needed to pay compensation. So we're proud of that. It's one of a great number of human rights and climate-focused pieces of litigation that have been going on for a while. And we've got a number of cases that we're working through at the European Court of Human Rights, really trying to embed that idea of a right to a healthy environment. But I think they're only going to increase. I think that climate-vulnerable populations are going to be bringing more cases. I think we'll have lots with a kind of loss and damage element to them, and it won't, of course, just be indigenous peoples. Any people for whom their government actually has a duty of responsibility to look after them.
On that subject, obviously this is a global. The rights of indigenous people and their plight as a global story. In which countries do you see, obviously a lot of your work depends on the legal system, on the country where you're taking the case. Where do you see sort of the most promising avenues for taking on those cases, and which are the countries where you think it's going to be harder?
Oh, that's interesting.
So obviously you've had success in Australia, but as you're talking, I'm thinking Indonesia, I'm thinking Brazil, I'm thinking Mexico,
So I think it really depends also on where we're operating and what the best way is for us to work in that place. So in some jurisdictions it works for us as Client Earth to work with people in local communities to take cases, and so we often want to work with citizens. So when we do clean air cases, we work on behalf of citizens who are suffering from air pollution. In some places it's not really, litigation is not the right approach for us, and we do much better. So in China, for example, we do really good work training prosecutors, making sure they've got the right legislation legislation in place so that they have their own field there of climate litigation. And in West Africa, we are working with communities, supporting them to develop their own approaches for forest conservation, for example. So I think it's different vehicles in different places, but I think it's quite interesting to look at how international law is being used. So in the UN Human Rights Council, what is the, how can we best use international law in some of these cases, and in a way that then makes governments around the world sit up and take notice and think about the reputational risk and also their obligations and legal duties. And then looking at regional human rights bodies. So the European Court of Human Rights is very important, but there are others as well, the Inter-American Human Rights Commission and so on. There was a very, very pivotal case, the Inuit claim in 2005 that actually was dismissed because it was kind of ahead of its time, but anyone who works on these human rights cases, they kind of refer to the arguments made there. But I think it's, again, I think that power of international law is really important, and ideally every country would have brought its international climate change commitments into domestic legislation, and then you would have a vehicle, as we do in the UK, but of course that's still the minority of countries.
So we've talked about human rights, we've talked about greenwashing. Of course, Climate Earth in many ways made its name by taking governments to court. Can you talk to us a little bit about some of the interesting cases that you have ahead of you when it comes to governments? I mean, you very successfully argued against the UK earlier this year.
So we've got a number of cases ongoing supporting citizens on clean air across, and we're trying to, we always try and, make it a sort of systemic approach. So with saying that actually governments have got an obligation to ensure clean air, because it's something like 93%, I know it's 93% of children around the world breathe air that is of potential risk to their health and development. And so that's a very, very big focus for us. And so I think, but then we will have other cases. Sometimes, of course, it's a bit tricky to talk about what we have coming up because,
of course,
it takes a while before they launch. But just looking across the waterfront, and the trick, of course, is working out where we can have the best impact. Because, you really need to spot, where are the areas where an illegal intervention here can really tip things over. And so we work closely with a whole lot of other organizations who are really good at doing the analysis of that sort of thing, mapping where the issues are, where progress isn't going fast enough, and then thinking about the theory of change there. And a big focus at the moment for us, and this is coming back to the corporate side, is on the theory of change, thinking about the responsibilities and personal responsibilities of directors. And, that sense that actually if you can really get at the sense of an individual being liable, that's quite powerful rather than a sort of rather more anonymous corporate. And so we've done a couple of shareholder action cases, which are really interesting. So our big, really quite significant one was a couple of years back against Enea, which is a Polish energy company, and they were planning to build a great big new coal-fired power station. We took a case as shareholders, having some shares in Enea. We said, we don't think this is a good investment decision for the company. We think that the coal-fired power station will end up being a stranded asset. And the court agreed, and the coal-fired power station didn't go ahead. And on that very same day, the markets agreed as well, because the share price increased by 4%. And so, doing that, very much saying this is what we are arguing is in the interests of you as a company in terms of your long-term sustainability and us as shareholders, that's quite powerful. And we've got another case that's starting now, which is again a shareholder action case against Shell. And we're arguing that Shell's lack of a meaningful climate transition plan, climate mitigation plan, is a breach of the directors' fiduciary duties under the UK Companies Act 2008, because they are, again, they're thinking about the short-term returns for shareholders, but not thinking about long-term longevity. And so that's quite an exciting case, focused very much on the responsibility of those board of directors. And I think that focus on fiduciary duty is going to be an increasing vehicle for litigation around the world.
So you've talked about the cases that you're excited about. where you've had success? Where are you frustrated? Are there particular areas of climate litigation where it's just proving really difficult? Not just maybe for Planet Earth, but for some of your other organizations such as yours. What are the tough nuts to crack here?
Oh, it's a really good question. I'm not sure, 2 months in, I'm not sure what I've got enough of a sense of what's frustrating. What I do know is the areas that are a bit more uncharted territory, and where I think we want to be doing a lot more, and and that's a lot on the biodiversity side, but also looking across at supply chains, looking at food systems is so important, and finding the right vehicles there so that you can look and see, what's happening with big agribusinesses, what is their responsibility in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, but also deforestation. So that's an area that I think is a massive growth area, looking across and looking in a systemic way at supply chains, corporate due diligence that is not just about a company's operation right here, but across its entire supply chain and all its emissions.
And I presumably on biodiversity, you have the same challenge that lots of other people here at COP have. When you look at emissions, it's easy to quantify it. There's a vast corpus of data that you can hang your hat on. But in the biodiversity, it's just much harder.
It's much harder. It's much harder because you've got carbon tonnage, right, and you haven't got the same thing on biodiversity. But we have established lots of the tools, so like the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Risk Disclosures. If you can adapt that sort of thing and apply it to nature, we need to do it. I mean, the report just a couple of months ago from WWF that said that 70% of our biodiversity we've lost 70% of our biodiversity in the last 50 years, it's really urgent. And I think, in a way, the sort of COP and CBD different events mean that we kind of think we've just got to talk about climate when we're at COP. You can't separate them out, right? It's all part of the same problem. And often when we take a case, it will be getting at both biodiversity and nature issues, but also, of course, climate, particularly when you're talking about deforestation. That speaks to everything, and community rights as well.
I think at this point we're happy to take questions from the audience. Meg has been collating questions. Do we have anything? Oh, no questions. No questions have been sent in yet. One issue I wanted to talk to you about also, I mean, we've talked about the UK, Europe, Australia. The US always seems like it's a jurisdiction where we're constantly waiting for something big to happen, but it doesn't quite happen. Is the US an area in which you're doing a lot of work, or?
We're just starting up in the US, actually. Or rather, we've been there for a while, but very much focused on our development fundraising activity, and we've got lots and lots of great supporters in the US. But we've just launched our first case in the US, which is a greenwashing case against a gas company. And our focus there is very much on the corporate sector, because the corporate sector, if you're thinking about how do you change things, you've got to actually turn the juggernaut that is investment finance business to be net zero aligned. And for us, the best way that we do that is through the fiduciary duties, through the responsibilities of companies. And so we've got a very sort of working on, in Delaware, where lots of these companies are listed, looking at their fiduciary duties. What are the actual legal responsibilities of directors for climate, and working that out, and then sort of mapping that across to companies that we can, I suppose, make an example of.
You mentioned BP on the greenwashing front. BP, can you mention some of the other companies you're looking at?
So we've got one against Total Energies in France that we're doing with some other partners in France. We have one against Glencore in Australia, which is investing in new coal while all the time saying that it is doing the right thing in climate terms. Those two things don't add up. And that's listed in London, so there are sort of, the implications there and sort of levers there that we can use. And we've got a very interesting one against the airline KLM, which is essentially, under Dutch consumer protection laws, that says that KLM's advertising, which is all about sustainable aviation, is misleading consumers, because it's saying, it's implying that we're basically very much on the brink or almost there already in having sustainable aviation, and therefore that's going to encourage more people to fly. We know that flying is not sustainable. And so that's an interesting case as well.
And so why, I mean, presumably you could make that argument about a lot of airlines. Why KLM in particular? Is it just because?
It's because their advertising is so focused on this aspect.
Yeah.
And, you know, and it's really making a really big play about everything that it's doing on the sustainability side. And when you look at the development in sustainable aviation fuel, we are a very, very long way from that being a reality. And, you know, certainly you've got, for short hop flights, you can do electric, but, you know, in terms of your normal length of flying, normal size aeroplanes, and I'm not an expert on types of aeroplane, but, you know, we're a long way from electric or hydrogen working there, and we're a long way from sustainable aviation fuel being mainstream.
Yeah. Laura, thank you so much for joining us this morning. We are out of time, unfortunately, but
thank you very much.
Yeah.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Please welcome to the stage Jolene Connors-Belopolsky, Chief of Staff and External Affairs at the Clean Cooking Alliance, Susan Chamba, Director of Vital Landscapes at the World Resources Institute, and Sophie Odupoy, Group Head of Public Affairs at Cocoa Networks, for a conversation with Bloomberg's Yinka Ibukin.
Thank you for joining us for this panel on innovative cooking solutions and food security. Before we start, I'll just make a call for questions. Please scan the QR code and keep your questions coming so that we can get to them at the end of the panel. And to get right to it, I'll start with charcoal and the fact that it's a main driver of deforestation in Africa. Starting with Jolene, how did we get there?
Well, I think we're here because the world collectively has failed to prioritize and invest in one of the most critical levers we have to address the triple planetary crisis of climate, biodiversity, and nature loss, and that's clean cooking. Around the world, 2.4 billion people have no access to clean cooking solutions and instead rely on traditional, harmful, and polluting fuels to cook their daily meals. And this comes at an enormous cost to both the economy, that's estimated $2.4 trillion of loss each year in local economic loss, climate and environmental impacts, to human health, more than 3 million premature deaths each year from indoor air pollution, predominantly women and children, and massive land destruction in terms of forest degradation. 34% of all biomass harvested for household fuel use is done so unsustainably, and it's done so in precious biodiversity hotspots and carbon sinks around the world. We look at DRC, for example, which is home to one of the most precious and incredible forests and carbon sinks and biodiversity hotspots with 10,000 species that provide the equivalent of 10 years of carbon services to the planet. 90% of the population in the Democratic Republic of Congo relies on charcoal for cooking, and they are losing 1 million acres of forest each year just due to household fuel collection. At this rate, 30% of the forest will be gone by 2030 and completely razed by 2100. And that is a service that not only provides clean air, water, biodiversity to the Congo Basin, to the continent of Africa, but to the entire planet. And so we really need to think about what cooking plays in the global climate development and ecosystem services, and get serious about how we can make a difference in something that seems very small and somewhat niche and is not often as exciting or as sexy as large-scale infrastructure projects or some of the other decarbonization work that we are discussing this week. But it is something that adds up. 2.4 billion people every meal, every day.
Angeline, you've given us an idea of the scale of the damage. Taking it to Susan, what's being done to conserve forests, to protect them, and to restore them?
Maybe just to add a little bit on the point that you've just raised, absolutely spot on, and especially in countries like DRC. But also to mention that charcoal production, wood fuel energy, is also a big source of livelihood and income for a significant majority of people who don't have other alternative sources of livelihood. So even as we are thinking about transitioning to clean cooking, we have to think that we are going to displace a huge number of people who are working in that sector. Actually, when I started doing my master's thesis, I did study about the production of charcoal in Tanzania and looking at whether there are sustainable ways of producing it. And of course, on the economy side, there could be ways of producing charcoal, but on the health side, it is very, very difficult to justify continuation of using these sources of energy, and especially with the significant negative impacts that we are seeing on rural women. More than 90% of them who are now suffering from respiratory-related kind of illnesses as a result of huge exposure from wood, smoke, and other sources of unclean energy. So what is being done? There's a lot of work that is being done. First of all, I must say we are looking at more treating the symptoms as opposed to looking at the underlying, causes of where we are. So for the treating of symptoms, what we are doing a lot is to look at landscape restoration, of course, areas that have been degraded. And Africa is one of the continents with one of the biggest landscape restoration programs on the across the world. We have the AFR 100, that's the Africa Forest Restoration Initiative, which has an ambition to restore at least 100 million hectares by 2030. We are seeing huge national commitments. We are seeing a lot of local level activities by civil society organizations, farmer groups that are trying to restore areas that have been degraded. But as I say, when we are trying to restore, but not looking at what is driving deforestation and addressing clean cooking sources, providing alternative sources of livelihoods, you're planting trees on one hand and they are being cut on the other hand. So I think we need those kind of systemic integrated interventions, both in terms of restoring what has been degraded, as well as providing alternative clean cooking energy sources and alternative sources of livelihood for people who will be displaced from that sector.
And speaking of alternatives, Sophie, at Cocoa, you've managed to actually convert charcoal users to cleaner sources of cooking. Can you speak to that experience?
Okay, thank you so much. So at Cocoa Networks, we have managed to bring together technology, infrastructure, policy together to provide fuel utility. And what we are using, the fuel we are using is bioethanol. So we've managed to bring this affordably to people who otherwise have only the option of charcoal or firewood. So it's literally the people who have no other alternative and have no way of getting access to clean cooking. We launched this. We retail a 2-burner cooker, and the bioethanol is dispensed using ATMs. So rather than bottling and putting more plastic out there, our focus is on making sure that a household, they can actually buy the bioethanol. So we use a reusable canister. And underpinning this is technology. So technology is along the whole value chain. And then we ensure that the ATMs are literally where these people live, because we need to adapt to how they buy and how they cook. So it's literally a stone's throw away from where they live. So we handle the downstream. Upstream, what we have done is we decided not to reinvent the wheel. Fossil fuel liquid companies have the infrastructure to transport liquid fuel. So we have converted pre-existing systems, and that is what we use to transport the bioethanol and get it as close as we can to the consumers. We have done this very successfully in Kenya. Currently, we are at 700,000 households in just slightly over 3 years, which is amazing. But the reason we're so successful is because of carbon. Yeah, if you think about our business model, needs carbon credits. We sell carbon credits, which enable us to make the solution affordable. A 2-burner cooker, together with the canister, currently retails at $15. If you think about it, the whole kit, together with, we give 2 free refills, would retail at $100. But carbon enables us to be able to get it affordably to the people that need it most. More importantly is we have signed an investment agreement with Rwanda for us to launch there next year. And we're appealing to governments in all the other countries where deforestation is the leading charcoal due to deforestation and the challenges that come with it. We are appealing to them, do engage with us. We are open and we're willing to have the conversations about what it will take for us to come and scale in their country. Thank you.
What's interesting about your model is quite radical in terms that you've gone all the way to provide a biofuel accessible with your cocoa points and distribution networks. How do you feel about people who say that, and there's a lot of push that's been done to use liquefied natural gas, which is less polluting than charcoal, but probably more polluting than ethanol. What do you feel about the use of LPG as a way to the transition?
Okay. First of all, I'll say 2030 is not that far off. And I think we've repeatedly said this. The Earth is not waiting for us. We need everyone to come on board. So for us, we are playing in that sector, the people who are absolutely underserved, who cannot see a pathway to a clean and renewable fuel. So LPG has its place. Julien talked about 2.6 billion people. It doesn't make sense for us to try and say, I'm here first, I need to have right of way. Everybody has an opportunity to provide a clean solution, so why don't we all go out there and see what we can do to bring on board as many of these people who currently do not have the option? And I've repeatedly said this, it doesn't help for someone to have food, and there's no way for them to convert that raw food into something that they can eat. We need to pull our hands together and make sure that at the end of the day, they have a hot meal. They have something that a mother can feed her children, can feed, and we can feed the community, and we can make sure that everybody has something that is nutritional. Thank you.
Jeline, would you like to add to that about the solutions that you're seeing?
No, absolutely. I mean, I echo Sophie. I think we as the Clean Cooking Alliance, we really do work across the entire clean cooking value chain and all of the viable fuels and technologies that are available, because they are very context specific. And we are trying to reach billions of people in countries across Africa, Southeast Asia, Latin America, where the context and the local resources and the circumstances and the livelihoods are all very different. So being able to develop innovative business models and utilize technologies and resources that are available that meet the needs of people where they are today and provide affordable, accessible choice. This is not necessarily about some benevolent donor deciding that, you know, this is a wonderful cook stove, we want to give it to you in your home, in your village, and tick the box of access to clean cooking. This is about developing sustainable markets and solutions and providing people with fuels and technologies that they can afford, that they want, that meet their needs, that work within their lifestyles. And in many markets, ethanol is a phenomenal technology, and companies like Cocoa are delivering resources to communities at a pace and a scale that is really, truly commendable. But in other cases, particularly in agricultural areas, the fuel of choice may be biogas, where you can combine sustainable livestock and regenerative agriculture with a biogas system that provides cooking fuel as well as, you know, fertilizer to enhance agricultural production. So it really is about thinking about the context and the needs of people and communities and providing a suite of solutions that people want and can afford. And this is where these types of models, the pay-as-you-go, ATMs, innovative consumer financing, so that we can build a market for clean cooking solutions and engage people in those value chains. This is not about taking away charcoal infrastructure, which so many people rely on, not just to cook their food,
but for income generation as well. How do we transition a charcoal value chain into another form of sustainable energy value chain, whether that's biomass pellets, biogas, an ethanol supply chain, or being involved in an LPG distribution supply chain. LPG, whether we want to admit it or not, because of the fossil nature, is the fastest and most economic way to achieve access to clean cooking in many countries. And it is a climate and environmental win compared to the baseline of unsustainable biomass use. So if we are serious about climate goals, as well as health and environmental goals, we have to be willing to consider LPG where it is appropriate.
And Susan, would you like to react to that?
Very difficult to add to the brilliant points that have already been raised here. Without the risk of repeating myself, I think we really need to emphasize context-specific solutions. And also be aware that anything that sounds like a quick fix is probably not a very good and sustainable solution. So for instance, as we are working on the food security side, we get very worried with sources of biomass fuel or others that would perhaps then have a negative impact on food security. So for instance, if we want to produce clean cooking from, for instance, starch, you can produce from any starch. Innovations can produce from maize, from potatoes, any kind of starch can be used for producing. But then on the other hand, you have to think about the food security risk that could be associated with that. So it's very important, as I think you've already mentioned, that the most important thing is to look at what's the context, what are the options that are available. I am not an expert like yourselves on clean cooking. I'm more an expert on food security, land management side, and that's where it's good to create that balance. I'm also very much aware of unexploited potential on the biogas side, and especially where we have livestock, stall-fed livestock, and that could actually have a very big positive impact when we use that methane, not release it into the farms, and obvious ammonia as well that comes from the slough from livestock production. There's a huge potential there, but I think there has been a challenge in terms of setting up biogas in rural communities in Africa, which has been exactly the model that you've described, where a certain development partner comes, sets up the production, the biogas production in a homestead without properly engaging with communities, with the women, with understanding how the system works, with discussing with them potential risk. And most of the time, once it's set up and the NGO goes, the women don't use it. It's, and we have a lot of those disconnects. It's a huge investment. So really having discussions and engagements with the users of these technologies, designing them in a way that they understand them, and really letting them know whether there are any kind of risk that they should be aware of, or it's just an attitude or lack of knowledge that may be leading to this kind of behavior, social behavior, sort of resistance patterns is extremely important. So just wanted to say absolutely spot on, contextually understanding what are the issues, co-designing these interventions and with the local and especially the end users, and ensuring that we are keeping in mind there could be some trade-offs when we look at some of the systems that could be providing the clean sources of energy.
And also, Susan, I'd love for you to break down for us, because I think it's not that obvious, the connection between clean cooking and food security. Could you actually break down why that impacts food insecurity?
Absolutely. First of all, it's a two-sided thing. As Sophie rightly mentioned, it's pointless to be able to produce food, to have food that then cannot be cooked in a clean way. So if there's no reliable sources of energy, then you can't have the end goal of achieving food security. So that's absolutely very clear. And in rural Africa, there are some places where now land has been so degraded that women spend hours going to look for firewood. and children as well. And this is time that could be used for other productive activities at the household level. So that's one connection, that you can't have a food security angle unless you have reliable, affordable, clean cooking sources. The other angle is to look at where is this coming from. So that's where I said a lot of it could come from starch, that can be used. I've seen ethanol that is being produced maybe from cassava, that is being produced from maize. And so I'm not saying that this is a bad source of energy, but in a context, in a continent where we have 200 million people every year suffering on average, that's an average. A time like now when we've had drought, the number has been over 300 million people facing hunger and insecurity. And so it becomes very difficult to justify why we would be using, for instance, maize or cassava that can be used to feed people to produce the energy for cooking. So it's a two-sided coin. And so that's where we need to strike the balance. But I think Cocoa Networks is very innovative, definitely very much aware of these dimensions. I use your two-burner cooking at home, and it's fabulous. And also they've actually cracked the model of access, which is another thing, that they really have ensured it's affordable, because for clean cooking adoption, it has to be affordable, it has to be accessible, and it has to have people have to have the right attitude towards it. Yeah. I didn't need a lot of convincing myself, because I can be able to access it very easily within the localities in Nairobi. I think we still need to have more infrastructure for countrywide access, but you're using mainly leftovers from sugarcane production and other kind of what would actually be food loss or food waste. And that's where we have huge potential. Where we have food loss and food waste, materials that could end up being lost can be converted to usable products. So I'm just saying it's contextually relevant, specific, and I think there's opportunities to catalyze its transformation as long as we are aware of the balances that we need in the system.
Thank you. At this point, we have time for one or two audience questions, so I'll turn my attention to Meg.
The first one we have is actually coming from our online audience. Which food groups require the highest energy inputs during cooking, and can diets be modified to enable minimal energy use in energy-stressed areas?
Again, it's a very sort of cultural, contextual question. I think there are a lot of staples, grains and beans and rice that naturally take a longer time to cook. But the question, yes, we can modify diets, but I think for the markets that we're serving and the people that daily are collecting wood and harvesting their own food, it's a little less about shifting their diet to match the minimal amount of energy that they have, and more to being able to provide a really minimum, we're talking basic amount of energy here. We need to get people off of this minimal amount of energy to cook one meal or 2 meals a day, whether that consists of beans or rice or anything that needs to be cooked for a long time. I think it's a slightly unfair question for this segment of the population to think about switching diets when so many people are, on a subsistence living, growing the food that they themselves are eating. Yes, there are ways to cook foods faster or cook different foods, but I think at this stage, talking about the connection of food and energy in terms of dietary intake is slightly off topic. But I think this is where these questions around how we link food security and energy security need to come together. And as Susan was saying before, it should be impossible to talk about food without cooking or cooking without food. But yet, as the world is grappling to come to terms with this unprecedented hunger crisis and look at solutions, cooking is very rarely seen as part of a sustainable food system, despite the fact that it affects nutrition on the consumption side, and it impacts land degradation and our ability to grow food in the first place. So we actually really need to bring these conversations together. And when we talk about sustainable agriculture, when we talk about shifting diets, we need to be realistic about the role that cooking and energy plays in all of those solutions so that we are actually addressing the challenges that people are having versus having a theoretical debate over sort of changing diets and how can we reduce energy consumption to cook. So I'll leave it at that.
And we'll try and take one last question.
For everyone, you are here at COP. What would you hope to see that could help to address the issues that you're working towards?
I think first I'll echo what Jillian said. The fact that clean cooking needs to be prioritized. It's starting to gain momentum. There has been a lot of focus when people talk about renewable energy. It's about electricity and lighting up homes. But forgetting, again, you need to talk about both electricity, powering the homes, with clean cooking energy. So for me, it's critical to see clean cooking take its rightful place, but more importantly, for conversations about clean and renewable solutions take center stage. We need governments to step up and understand that without them being a partner to private sector players, there's no way we are going to be able to scale the solutions that we have. Radical as they are, we will not be able to scale them and be able to provide an alternative solution. I'm from Kenya. Our president has committed to planting 5 billion trees. I'm sure that's the same across a lot of African countries. But until we are able to provide the alternative, people will be planting trees, waiting a short period, and then they're cut down. So until we're able to do that side by side, it will be a loss. So it's critical that clean and renewable energy is front and center. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those last words and just bringing it home. And now I will pass it on to my green colleagues, Laura Milan and Aaron Woodcroft. Thank you so much.
Hello, I'm Aaron Rutkoff. I'm Laura's editor. And we're here to talk about a story that Laura wrote with some of our colleagues from the Egyptian Bureau in the most recent issue of Green Magazine. The sort of premise of the story is where I want to start. So we all are here at COP with the awareness that we're at 1.2 degrees Celsius of warming. There's been a lot of talk about this being a COP where people are grappling with whether the 1.5 degrees Celsius target that's in the Paris Agreement is still practical. But we looked at Egypt as a place that's kind of even farther in the future than that. Can you talk a little bit about how we sort of set up this story that we told?
Yes, absolutely. So when we started thinking about how we would tell the climate story from Egypt, since COP was happening here in Egypt, we actually realized that Egypt is the perfect example to talk about these issues because it's a country that has already warmed by 2 degrees Celsius. So the rest of the world, on average, has warmed by 1.1. Egypt has warmed by about 2 degrees since the start of the last century. And if the planet is heading for a warming of 3 degrees under current levels of emissions by the end of this century, what Egypt is facing is actually 5 degrees of warming by the end of this century. So what we wanted to do was take a bunch of scientific data and projections that are available today and see what Egypt would look like by the end of the century if the world warmed on average by 3 degrees Celsius.
So as an editor, this really appealed to me, Laura's idea, because it's difficult to bring into reality some of the things that are just exist in models or in prospects for the future. And I really like the idea of all of the diplomats and world leaders descending into a place that was kind of already at the 2-degree warming threshold that all of the Paris Agreement and the COP process is trying to prevent. Can you talk a little bit about what makes Egypt so vulnerable? And I want to start by prefacing and saying that you have some experience reporting in Egypt before even you became a climate journalist. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. So I used to live here 10 years ago. It's bad when you say 10 years because you realize how old you're getting. So I used to live here 10 years ago, and I mean, even now I was just talking with the colleagues in the Cairo bureau that helped me report on this story, and I would tell them, oh, I remember when I lived here, how nights in Cairo would like open up the windows and there'd be a nice breeze over the Nile, and they were like, yeah, that's not happening anymore in summer. So even in 10 years, the climate and the weather have changed and the conditions have changed. So what makes Egypt so vulnerable? I think except for glacier melting, every other extreme event that is driven by climate change takes place in Egypt. So Egypt is vulnerable to sea level rise. So you all have flown here, might have seen the delta from the air. It's an amazing view. It's also likely to disappear. Big parts of it are likely to disappear because the levels of the Mediterranean Sea are rising very fast. It's also vulnerable to drought. The Nile River is carrying less and less water. It's raining less and less, and when it does so in patterns that are strange. So, rains a lot in very few days or very few hours, leading to floods.
Wait, before we go on to the other ones, let's stick with sea level and water issues for a second. So one of the characters that stood out in this piece was the farmer named Abdel Salam. It's kind of crazy to reckon with the fact that it's both a drought, like a lack of water country, and also a flooding country at the same time. Can you kind of talk about what his life is like? And also, as part of the process of this story, I know you looked for solutions to all of the problems that we're identifying. So I guess tell the story of this farmer and what he's doing to grapple with the hotter world he's in now.
Sure. So first of all, when we did this story, we didn't want to write doom and gloom. So for each problem, we looked for a solution that was taking place today. So my colleague Salma Al-Wardani, who is a member of the Cairo Bureau, went up to the Nile Delta, to the very last village before the Nile reaches the Mediterranean Sea. It's a village called Baltim. And she met this farmer, Abdel Salam, who, together with a bunch of farmers in his village, have raised money among themselves to set up a system to try to save their crops, basically. So what's happening in that part of Egypt is that the Mediterranean Sea is rising. And even if the sea has not made it to the crops yet, the salt from the sea is filtering up through the soil and killing the crops, essentially. So, and the water that they used to irrigate is getting saltier and saltier. So what the farmers are doing is using desert irrigation techniques, so dripping techniques. And they've bought the tubes, they've bought the engines that they need to pump the water and to purify it to be able to water the crops.
So going down your list of climate impacts that you looked to Egypt for, I know desertification was on that list. In your story, it's interesting to learn that Egypt had like a whole history as an aggressive tree planting country, and you can't go to a climate event without having a ton of talk about tree planting. So what did you learn about the history of Egyptian efforts to fight the encroaching deserts with trees?
Yeah, one of the most interesting things I learned actually is that Egypt used to have a forestry policy back in the Middle Ages when they rose trees to build palaces and also build boats. So Egypt historically has experience in that, and in the modern days they actually came up with a quite smart way of planting trees in the desert, which was they would take sewage water from big cities and purify it and use it to irrigate forests. And they realized that the forests are growing quite fast and that the trees have high survival rates. So it's a system that the scientists they talked to was surprised about the results that hadn't been seen in other experiments.
So let's also, I want to ask you about the urban nature of life in Egypt. I know that became a big point of focus when you were looking at what the hotter future will be like here. Were there particular solutions that suggested themselves based on the fact that Egypt is an increasingly urban society?
Yeah, that's it. So most of the Egyptian people live in cities. Cairo is a huge city. Population in Egypt is going to double by the end of the century, and most of these people will end up living in cities. So urban heat obviously is a big problem here and elsewhere. And we started to look at the solutions, as you might know. And again, if you've flown here and looked out of the window from the plane, you might have seen the huge suburbs that are being built right now outside of the old Cairo. And we looked at one project called Noor, and it's a suburb that's being built with 140,000 homes that might be able to host up to 700,000 people. It's been marketed as a green suburb, a place where people will be able to cool off from the urban heat. There will be electric vehicles, there will be solar panels, that sort of thing. But of course, and again, that's another thing that shows the contradictions within the climate problem. These will only be accessible to fairly wealthy people. So the people that don't have access to the money to pay for these nice houses will be stuck in the very hot, increasingly hot suburbs of Cairo.
So we went back in time to talk about the origins of Egypt's forestry policy, going even further back to the ancient monuments that are such a big part of the economy and the tourism basis here. What are the climate impacts on all the elements of antiquity that are surrounding us in Egypt?
One would think that the ancient monuments, the pyramids, the temples that Egypt is famous for, that have survived over 3,000, 4,000, some of them 6,000 years, would be undisturbed by climate change, but that's not the case actually. So I talked to the archaeologists working down there in Luxor, and they told me how the changing patterns of rain that I referred to before, and also intensive agriculture, are changing the humidity levels on the soil and the way underwater currents work. And so that's making its way into the ancient monuments, and that humidity is essentially eating them up. And so the solution that they have come up with, and these are projects funded by the Egyptian government and USAID and a bunch of other institutions, is to install giant pumping stations, water pumping stations below the monuments so that soil can remain dry. But of course that, again, and the same that happens with people in Cairo, you can only do that for a limited number of monuments because Egypt is absolutely covered by ancient monuments. They're everywhere, and these are expensive works that you can only undertake in the most well-known ones.
So the last element that you looked at was the struggle to protect biodiversity in Egypt, and especially efforts to protect corals in the sea and marine biodiversity. Can you talk about what you learned there?
Yeah, so one interesting thing I found out was that while we know a lot about what happens to corals in the Great Barrier Reef in Australia, for example, we don't know much about what happens here in the Red Sea, and this is a problem that's extensive to the whole of Africa. So there is very little scientific data on Africa in general. There are very few weather stations, there's very few scientific investigation, and that goes for the corals as well. So I found an organization that's trying to set up a citizen science project at the Red Sea, so every person diving on the Red Sea can collect scientific data to figure out how the corals are doing.
Well, we have a couple minutes left to end. I think we have a question from the audience, so I want to turn over to Meg.
And another question from our online audience. Egypt is generally fairly well positioned geographically for some types of solar and wind energy. What is being done to take advantage of that?
Yeah, absolutely. So renewable power is one of the big hopes for Egypt, as well as green hydrogen, which needs renewable power to work. And we didn't specifically look at these solutions in our story because they're the ones that people talk about the most, so we figured they were well known already. But of course, Egypt's huge desert offers incredible opportunity and is in itself a big solution to the problem.
So now that we're just with a couple minutes left, I guess the starting point of this story was looking at vulnerability. And so if you think about the sort of most negative case for the future in Egypt, let's sort of look at like what kind of fills you with dread when you think about the hotter future for Egypt, and then also sort of where you see the most prospect for solutions in Egypt. So I guess what's sort of the downside case when you're looking at the hotter future here?
I mean, everything we've talked about, right? Like, what if the country gets so hot that living here becomes just a nightmare? And that's one of the things a scientist I talked to referred to. He said, well, climate change is not going to make us all go extinct like dinosaurs, right? Like, we're all going to be here in 2100, we're all going to be here in 200 years more, 300 years more. It's just a matter of how we want to live this future. And he was saying, we just want to keep living our lives the way we have for thousands of years. And that statement is quite significant when it comes from an Egyptian, I think. So that's the fear, right? Like, that's the worst future, is not being able to live a decent life in the future. My hope is that this doesn't happen, that we manage to find a way to radically cut emissions, and that's why we're here at COP as well, and why, you know, we're hoping all of the leaders meeting at COP will come up with solutions that significantly cut emissions and slow the warming.
And do you, I know one of the other cool projects you worked on over the course of this very hot summer looked at like using satellite data to find the coolest spots in the hottest cities in the world. Do you think that there are ways that Egypt can be sort of a test case for some of the solutions that you found in that story?
Yeah, absolutely. So I personally don't believe that building new cities is a solution to urban heat. I come from Europe, and Europe's trying to rehabilitate and like to make existing buildings better, because that has a smaller carbon footprint, but also is more practical. In the case of Cairo, for example, we know that large water bodies help cool cities. Cairo has the Nile flowing right in the middle of it. It's also home to some interesting experiments, like a park called Al-Azhar, that if you spend any time in Cairo, I really recommend you to visit. It's beautiful. That park was built on top of a waste deposit, a place that was used to just throw waste. And because it was organic waste, it became fertile ground for a beautiful park that's all covered in grass, trees, and lakes. So definitely there are ways to make existing cities better and more adapted to heat.
Well, I'm so glad you did this story, and thanks for
you.
bringing it in.
Thanks, everyone. So I'm going to be staying here now to moderate our next conversation about actually cities and heat with two very interesting people. They're Yvonne Aki-Sawyer, the mayor of Freetown in Sierra Leone, and also Eleni Meriveli, the global chief heat officer at UN Habitat. So welcome, Yvonne and Eleni. I don't know if you could hear what we were just talking about now, but I think it was a good last question. Aaron, my editor, was asking about how to adapt cities to heat, and that's actually your job. So my first question is, you are both chief heat officers. That's a fairly new role.
Well, Yvonne has a great chief heat officer working
the
for
mayor.
her, but she is the mayor. And
That's right, yes,
but
sorry.
she's one of the, you're right, she's one of the first mayors that actually placed the chief heat officer.
That's right. So I wanted to talk about this role, about the chief heat officer. It's fairly new. Every city has people dealing with urbanism or waste or finances, but heat is something relatively new. So I will throw my question to Yvonne first. Why don't you tell us what a chief heat officer does, and why does it make sense that cities have one?
Thanks very much. So about 2 years ago, Freetown, along with Athens, joined an alliance called City Champions for Heat. And through the work that we're doing and the conversations we're having, and this was all working with the Arched Rock Resilience Center, it became clear that heat is the silent killer that just doesn't get the attention. It's not like the mudslides, the landslides, the storms that people can see. And even when you have like a major drought, the focus is often not on that heat that's there all the time. It's just rising and increasing. We felt that it was necessary to have somebody to focus on this. It's a killer. The data is now showing that heat kills far more people than any other climate-induced change, weather event. But no one is looking at the data specifically. No one's understanding it. In our city, for example, we've been able to now, because we have a chief heat officer, we've been able to now design specific mitigating strategies around that. So the value of the person is the value of the focus. It means we can focus on heat.
Perfect. And Yvonne, Eleni, if I can ask you, you are kind of in the next step. There are now several chief heat officers in cities across the world, but you are transitioning into a new role of global chief heat officer. What does that mean, and what will you be able to do under this new role?
So yes, we have 6 chief heat officers. Athens, Freetown, Sierra Leone, Santiago de Chile, Miami-Dade, the first one, Monterrey in Mexico, Melbourne, Australia, and Los Angeles. And it's all women, and it's an amazing team. I've been in Athens for many years working on resilience, and I realized that heat is the most challenging aspect of climate change that Athens is dealing with and will have to deal with. And as Yvonne said, very few people know about it, and a lot of what I've been doing is raising awareness. And so I think of my role in 3 distinct pillars. One is raising awareness. The other one is preparedness, making sure that we put into place actions for the most vulnerable, that protect the most vulnerable. And the third one is the redesign, which has to do with what you guys were talking before of how do we make our cities, which are now becoming more and more death traps the way that they're built, how do we make them cooler? And because air conditioning spaces is just not going to cut it. It's not going to get us out of this mess. It's actually just making things worse. So I am now transitioning to the UN Habitat in a more kind of global role, again focusing on cities, because cities are where the impact is most felt and most importantly felt, both on the human bodies, which, as Yvonne said, they're not made for this type of heat, but also in the economies of our cities, which are impacted from heat, in violence in our communities, in even education. We know that is affected from again. I think Yvonne can speak on this as well. But the general idea is to have both an advisory role for things that are happening in cities that might want to fold in heat, as well as an advocacy role within the UN environment agencies for elevating the heat.
Perfect. And you've referred to a few of the problems that cities and chief heat officers face. I was wondering, first Yvonne and then Eleni, if you could talk about specific problems that you have seen and faced in your cities and a solution that you applied to them.
Okay, so my city of Freetown in Sierra Leone, in case you're wondering where that was, is really different to Athens. But the heat challenge is the same. And to give you 2 examples, I think I'll use 2 examples because they're so pervasive. 60% of our population, of the women in our city, work in the informal sector. They're traders. And most of that trading happens outdoors. We don't have big covered markets. So if you think about a woman sitting from dawn to dusk in increasing temperatures, under sweltering sun, And very often, because of the sort of the circular impact of increasing heat, means water is less available. So you're thirsty and unable to quench that thirst. And even if you were, it's still not healthy. So that's like a snapshot of a problem. And many women, suffering from kidney problems because of that constant dehydration and not understanding and not knowing and actually not having a solution. A very simple solution that our chief heat officer came up with after research, looking at other things that she's seen in other places, was to build canopies, heat-resistant canopies. So they look like car parks, the kind that you have this just metal frame and the shade. But not only do we have the shade, to also help with economic productivity, there's solar light. So in the evening, the women can stay on longer. That's so simple, so easy to do, and yet so transformative. So that's a solution that we've been able to roll out into 3 markets. We have 42 markets. And when we talk about adaptation, we always have to talk about money, because even simple solutions like that cost money. And finding the money to deal with that is important. The second example I'll give, which really touches on every aspect of city life for us, is informal settlements. In as much as we have a big informal sector, we also have a provision of informal settlements. Over 35 to 40% of our residents live in informal housing. And the most common structure, material used, is corrugated iron. I'm sure you've seen pictures. Think of corrugated iron in the blistering heat. It's literally like being cooked.
Yeah.
So the heat, the impact of that, not just on women, but on children, on the elderly. So the work that we're doing includes and involves actually doing upgrades of communities, which means coming up with heat resistance, cooling, designs and materials. And it doesn't take a rocket science to know that if you're wanting to provide that kind of housing for over 300,000 people, that's a lot of money. Yes. So that's a solution in the making. We're starting with a pilot in one community, but to roll that out really needs more resource. And this sort of comes to a bigger challenge of where's the money coming from and how fast can the money move to adapt to climate change.
I really like that you raised this issue, because it's actually one of the loss and damage and climate finance is one of the things that people talk the most here at this COP. And here you have a live example of where the money can go to and what can be used for. Can you?
I can't top that. I can't top Yvonne, but I'll say
but
a little bit of what Athens is doing.
does have its own challenges, and you've talked about vulnerable people, elder, the women, children, and I'm sure they face challenges in Athens as well.
Yes, absolutely. Right? So just last year, not this summer, the summer before, we had a heat wave that lasted for over 3 weeks, and it reached 45 degrees Celsius. And there were also peri-urban fires, and most of the media was focusing on the fires because they are more visible and they're more, and of course they were right, because there was so much of forest burned, 3 times as much as the average. But anyway, what we're doing in Athens, I just want to say that what Yvonne was talking about, the fact that we need to really mobilize finances for adaptation, and especially for heat, is really, really crucial. And we have so many cities right now that are already suffering with temperatures that we can't even imagine. And we really need to move fast, because we're talking about 350 cities now facing temperatures above 35 degrees Celsius, and we expect in the next 2 decades that it's going to be 1,000 cities that are facing really, really crazy temperatures, and 1.6 billion people, and a little bit more than 1 billion people of those are living in informal settlements. So this is like a really urgent issue, and it's not going away. But I'll quickly go to Athens, and I'll be really fast. So in the preparedness and in the awareness raising and preparedness, what we did, we piloted this last summer, was a new categorization system that we work with the Ars Rock Resilience Center. They have a team of scientists that work with the Athenian scientists, and they created a categorization system which looks back at what kind of temperatures have been sitting specifically onto Athens for 2 decades, and what kind of mortality data we had, and correlates this to create 3 categories. So now decision makers and policy makers can actually look at the category and understand the percentage of risk on human life that you have per each category, which I think is groundbreaking. And also Seville, which did the same with Athens, the same categorization, was the first city to start naming heat waves.
Heat waves,
this last summer.
This last summer,
right.
Yeah.
And the first named heat wave was Zoe.
Yeah.
And so this was important. And I didn't think that naming was so important. But then my daughter called me. That's a side thing. She lives in Norway, she's studying. And she called me and she said, Mom, I heard you're naming categories. And I said, well, yes, Seville is doing it. And she said, when I heard it, I started crying. And I said, why? And she said, because it kind of felt that we are going to, that it's here to stay, and we're going to be dealing with it. And she knows I've been working with heat waves, but she started crying from the name. So I thought this is really significant, and I started thinking that naming is really, really important.
I was gonna say, like, it seems like a silly thing to just put a name to something. It doesn't really change anything. It doesn't change the fact, but it does help raise awareness. And that actually goes very well with my next question, which was going to be, how do you engage with citizens to raise awareness both about heat, but also about the actions that you're taking on the ground? What have you learned from your experiences in your cities? In your case, Yvonne.
So the market shade covers I described were done with the market women. There were discussions with them. They helped design them. In the 3 markets where they've been installed, they had to choose where. And one of the things which has been so gratifying is that even though our resources that we had couldn't extend to the length of the market, the women said to us, how much does this cost? We can put some money together to try to extend it ourselves. Now that's not a burden we want to put on them with their own limited resources, but it shows the acceptance and the understanding. So I think, as with the question of the naming, the other thing that we're doing is we're also working with scientists. We have a team that will be coming into Freetown in the next couple of months when the dry season starts. We're just going into the dry season now, and we're expecting the temperatures to keep on rising. But we're going to map heat islands. We know anecdotally where they are, but it will do 2 things for us. It will also help our reforestation drive. So we're in the middle of a campaign called #FreetownTheTreeTown. We're planting 1 million trees. We're planting 1 million trees and growing the trees.
Is there a tree fan down there?
I think there was a tree fan just there. And again, I know clean cooking has also been discussed, but the complexity of this is, I can easily just describe it as follows. So we're planting 1 million trees, but 82% of cooking fuel in my city is wood or charcoal. And that's because people have no affordable alternatives. So you've got this dilemma, and helping communities build their resilience and the determination and commitment to protect their trees. It's also helpful for them to understand and see the more direct link between their health outcomes and those trees. But it can't be done in isolation, because no matter how well-meaning you are, if you've got to cook a meal for your family and there's nothing else you can use but wood or charcoal, you're going to cook the meal for your family and deal with the long-term consequences of the heat further downstream. So when we talk about our response as a global community, we've got to see the urgency of bringing these solutions, driving them forward together. And I won't stop talking about the need for the money.
Yes. Well, that's the key to the problem, isn't it? And how about in Athens or other experiences in cities that you might have seen elsewhere? What can you tell us about how to best engage with citizens?
Well, it's very important, and a lot of cities do that. Athens is part of a couple of city networks, such as the Resilient Cities Network and the C40 Cities Network, working together with ICLEI as well. But when we started working with building resilience in Athens, we kind of learned that to build resilience, you really have to get the people with you. So we went through for every major project that we do, we make sure that to start with asking the people and trying to understand, as Yvonne said, what is the issue? And so with, I can talk about a lot of different cities and very interesting things they've done because, for example, how do you approach the people that usually you can't have access to? So some cities have gone into buses, into public transportation and started asking people in the bus or in the subway, like crazy place, so that because there's some populations that it's sometimes difficult to actually access. So we talk to a lot of different people, but for this particular case, I'll just get an example with how we built an early warning system this summer attached to the heat wave categorization. We first had this workshop with all of what were the vulnerable populations and different stakeholders around the vulnerable. So each table had one was for the people that were the seniors that live alone and the people that usually come in contact with them. Another was about immigrants, that there are too many immigrants often in apartments or that live in containers in camps around Athens.
And that's actually, I was going to say, that's a big issue in Greece that has received so much migration from, from the Middle East and Africa in the past.
You're right, Laura. It was a really big issue, especially a couple of years ago. Now we have, the populations are smaller because most people have wanted to leave. They didn't want to stay in Greece. But we still have quite a few and trying to get into the economy. Another group of people are the people that are homeless. Another vulnerable group is the people that are workers, that are outdoors. So we had to talk with unions. And so you kind of speak with each of one, try to understand what the issues are, and then find the strategic stakeholders or collaborators that can help you approach them and put things in effect. So for us, it was the Red Cross. Because, for example, the Red Cross is somebody that really people trust. So they can go from door to door and go to the old people, when they live alone and knock on the doors and check on them. And people open the door to the Red Cross and they feel safe with the Red Cross. And when they get information from the Red Cross, they trust it. So you have to find who are the partners that the people can trust and how you can take the people with you and kind of move with them to the different project that you want to do. The other project, which I'll just say a sentence, has to do with water, and I want to just put it in here because it's important. Each city has, and a lot of cities have been doing that, figuring out what is the water condition, how can we use water more sustainably, and how can we really use sources like sewage mining or figure out where we're really not using water properly and start really thinking hard about how to do it. And we're dealing with an ancient aqueduct in Athens and stuff like that. So that's another big issue. I just wanted to make sure I put it in here.
The aqueduct project actually is really good. So Elena was telling me about it, how they're using an ancient Greek aqueduct to bring in fresh water into Athens and kind of freshen the city. I want to open up for questions, but before that, just very quickly, I wanted to ask you, Yvonne, what's next for the city of Freetown? I know you've had some difficulties in your role, so nothing's a given. No path is straight. So what is the next challenge that you're facing? What's next? And same for you, Eleni, under your new role in the UN. If very quickly you could sum up what comes next for you, and then we'll let the audience ask questions.
Right. So. The thing about climate, we've got 17 SDGs, and number 13 is climate. But actually, to me, climate sits under everything because it's affecting everything. Our population's increasing rapidly because rural-urban migration is going off the scale as farming populations in rural areas are struggling to maintain a living, they're moving into the city. So the pressure on infrastructure means that you've got pressure on housing, which I've already described is so informal. For that same reason, those informal settlements are increasing. You've got transportation challenges. We have no mass transit. Our solution to that is we're seeking to implement for the first time ever, a cable car system based on the model in Medellin, which will introduce green public transit, connect communities, increase productivity, but all of this against a backdrop of an increasing population, more challenges with deforestation, increasing heat, more challenges on the health sector. And one of the biggest sort of gaps we have in our urban management as a city is that, bizarrely, even though the legislation provides for it, the city does not have the mandate to do land use planning or issue building permits. They're done by the central government, which means they're not done. So there is just madness. So what's next is a continuation of advocacy to change that, because the urgency of the moment cannot be overstated. There's been no time in which being able to plan for this future of climate and all that comes with it could be more important. So that's something that I've really got my eyes fixed on. And as you said, it's been challenging. But I believe that this is where the global community comes in. I've been saying for some time now that when we talk about climate change and we look at the national governments, the NDCs that they're submitting, there's got to be accountability. There's got to be accountability, and there's got to be a closer bringing the rhetoric and the reality closer together. That gap has to close. And in my city, there's no better way to do it than to go into those thorny areas of legislative mandates, advocating for city leaders to have the space they need to do the work that has to be done.
Awesome. And if, sorry, Eleni, because we've got just a couple of minutes left. No, that's okay.
That's fine. We can do a question.
Yes, let's let the audience ask questions, please, because.
My mic. Can historic buildings be modified to incorporate passive low-energy heat-controlled designs, or does building material require a complete revision in order to enhance temperature regulation?
Who wants to take that? It's a good question.
Often historic buildings are better than modern buildings. So it depends on the historic building. It depends which historic building and in which part of the world. But because using concrete and the way we've been building our cities, which is basically with concrete, cement, asphalt, glass, and steel, has been really depending on fossil fuels and the idea of endless resources, right? Especially fossil fuel, that we can do anything because we can just burn fossil fuel. So we have forgotten how to really build things. So if we get older buildings, sometimes they are better because they have smaller openings, for example, or they have thicker walls and they can function better. If we start kind of thinking of older things like whitewashing buildings outside, like they used to do in my country, in the Greek islands for the summer, or in Arab countries where you have like these incredible internal courtyards and stuff. But the materials, so I'm not answering exactly the question, but the materials are really important, and we can retrofit. We can always retrofit. We can also, there's like incredible technologies that are creating new types of materials that can be used. We just have to step it up, and there are people that are really looking for investments for things that are already starting to be piloted that we're really excited about. And I wish I had more time to answer more into this.
I think this one's for the mayor, and I think that I know your answer will be, but if there was one thing that you could see come out of this COP, what would it be?
Money.
I knew it. I knew it.
Yeah, definitely.
Real money. Not commitments, disbursements.
And fast.
And fast. And to the global south.
Yes, and to the global south.
Only 4% of all the adaptation financing so far has gone south. And that needs to change.
All right.
Thank you so much, Yvonne, Eleni, for being here with us today. It's been a great discussion, been great to hear you.
Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lauren.
Thanks, Lauren.
Please welcome to the stage Ali Zaidi, White House National Climate Advisor, for a conversation with Bloomberg Green's Akshat Rati.
Welcome, everybody. This is actually a live recording of the Zero podcast. So, Ali Zaidi, welcome to Zero.
All right. I'm on the podcast. I'm excited.
Now, we're going to talk a lot about collaboration because we are here at COP, but I cannot not talk about a big competition that's happening in Australia, where India is right now playing a semifinal. And there's a very high chance that India and Pakistan, I was born in India, you were born in Pakistan, is going to be playing the final on Sunday. Who are you excited about it?
Well, I think I have to root for the green cricket team, right?
Oh.
The green cricket team. I got to be on brand.
Well, look, India has the blue jersey.
That's fair enough.
Democrats.
Fair
You have to root for India now.
Fair enough.
Well, okay, let's put rivalries apart and talk climate. And let me start by doing you a favor and list all of the domestic climate successes of the Biden administration.
We'll be
in
here
the
for a
first
while.
2 years. And you can fill the gaps if I have any. So you passed 2 bills with bipartisan support. You actually got Republicans to vote for climate policy. Huge congratulations. You ratified the Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol, which reduces the amount of refrigerant gases put into the atmosphere. And if everyone follows it, that could cut temperatures by 0.5 degrees Celsius, a huge win. But the US was late to the party, but you got it done. Very important. You passed the IRA, the biggest climate bill the US has passed, putting $370 billion at least towards climate funding. Now, did I miss anything?
Oh, yeah. We set new standards on cars and trucks. The President signed an executive order. We're now moving towards 50% electric by 2030. In the industrial sector, oil and gas, we issued a methane reduction program that, by our measure, at least already, is aiming at something like 100 million metric tons. That's over a percentage point of US emissions reductions. We're doing stuff on federal procurement, which I hope we'll talk about, that's path-breaking. Steel, cement, flat glass, clean now and in the future. We're doing work on resilience and adaptation. You know, one of the things we have to realize is even if we're successful, we're still going to have to deal with the fires, the droughts, the floods, the hurricanes. We made a $50 billion investment, but we're also setting new codes and standards and doing research and development in that direction. We are, I think, doing really inventive work in next generation of building technologies, setting standards for a multitude of commercial and residential appliances, making them more energy efficient, leading the marketplace in that regard. And, you know, it can go on and on and on, but I think the other place where I would point folks to is the integration between what we're doing domestically and what we're doing internationally. You know, the relationship with the EU on the carbon adjustment, integrating considerations around CO2 in the way steel moves across borders, that's path-breaking. So, you know, so many touch points and very excited, hopefully, to drill down into some of them.
Well, all those wins get you to 40% reduction by 2030. It's still far away from the 50% target that Biden has set. And your job as the national climate advisor is to make sure that gap doesn't exist. What are you doing additionally now? We've talked about a long list to fill that gap.
So far away is subjective.
Well, you're at 30% reduction now.
So
you're
we're
going to 40% there,
We're
and then you're going 10% more. So that's halfway if you go from where you are today.
Yeah. So it's 2/3 of where we are from now, but I get you on the baselines. Never quibble with the terminal on the math. But look, I think there are a few things. Number one, the power sector drives a huge amount of the emissions reductions in this 2030 time horizon. And we talk a lot about this being the decisive decade for climate action. That's obviously not something we invented. It's a reality that the science imposes on us and that we're seeing all in our communities. But for the power sector, decisive decade means delivery, right? It means steel in the ground. And I think this is a challenge that folks face in a lot of jurisdictions around the world. How do we actually build these projects? Do we get the permitting done? Do we get the interconnection done? It's one thing to get the planning done for a solar project. It's another to make sure it's actually putting electrons on the grid. So that's going to be a big variable. And if you look at the modeling, some people say 40, some people say 42, some people say 43. The reason there's variability in large part is because of that power sector transformation. The second thing I'd note is there are a lot of these places that we've considered for a really long time to be hard to decarbonize, right? And, President Biden, I think, teases his team all the time. The hard things are what we're supposed to do in America. And so we've really gone and made a real focus of the industrial sector and the agriculture sector, these hard to decarbonize places, as opportunities. There's funding for that in the Inflation Reduction Act, and hundreds of millions of metric tons of opportunity.
So the senator for West Virginia, Joe Manchin, who was crucial to make sure the Inflation Reduction Act happens, is also trying to push a permitting bill. That will help a lot of coal, oil, and gas get permissions to go on the projects, but it will also help renewables and grids to be able to build, which require often much more land. So are you now rooting for Manchin to win?
I'm rooting for our clean energy economy, right? And I think rooting for our clean energy economy means not just setting targets and creating incentives for the microeconomics of the generation. It means paving the way so that, again, that stuff can come online. And one of the big issues that we face in the United States is this challenge of interconnection, right? So we've got all these projects that are planned that are stacking up, and they have no place to plug in. And this piece of legislation that's being contemplated in the United States Senate would help us plug those projects in. So look, unambiguously, clearly, and vigorously, I am rooting for our clean energy economy, our way to succeed, and that includes ways to get these projects plugged in.
Well, another bottleneck is that solar tariffs are hurting the US more than they are hurting China. That's from a recent report from Bloomberg Intelligence. Why do you keep those tariffs around if they are hindering the acceleration of renewable deployment in
Maybe
the
this
US?
is a place where I will push back on the terminal. I'm just kidding. What we've seen in the United States is a massive, massive, massive investment in our capacity to grow the solar supply chain. We're seeing that with allies and partners around the world. You see in other countries in Southeast Asia. We actually worked with India through the Development Finance Corporation to help First Solar, a company that is founded in Ohio, to expand its manufacturing operations base in India. So I think what we're seeing is a focus on supply chains that are sustainable, that live up to all of our values and standards, that are going to be more secure and reliable over the long term. And there's, a breadth of policy measures that help us do that work, and we're excited about that.
Now, let's come to the news outside of COP, which is the midterms. It seems likely, it hasn't been called yet, but it seems likely that the Democrats may lose at least one of the houses, which means that passing new legislation, any legislation, is going to be nearly impossible. Should we expect no more new climate laws for the next 2 years from you?
So let me say three things, and one of which is slightly snarky. I went back and I read all of the headlines from the last time we came to the COP. And, you know, we had the Post and Reuters and Times and others saying, there's a cloud hanging over Biden, and will he really deliver? And he's here, but can he get Congress to come along with him? Point number one is, we did. People love to, I think, view the process with skepticism, and I think time and time and time again, Joe Biden has delivered. So that's thing number one. Thing number two is the point that you made earlier, the bipartisan infrastructure law. Republicans and Democrats included $15 billion for an electric vehicle charging network, 500,000 chargers coast to coast in the United States, made by union workers in America, right? That same bill included $15 billion to modernize our grid, $50 billion to take on resilience. So Joe Biden was able to get Republicans to vote for that. He was able to get Republicans to vote for the Kigali Amendment ratification. Third point, the political economy of climate action in the United States, and I say this as someone who's in the Obama administration, who's been in the private sector, who's sat at a university and mused at what's going on, from Stanford, beautiful place to muse at the world from. And over that longitude, the secular and unambiguous trend of political economy in the United States on climate action is positive. And the reason is because we now see the economic upside, not just in the boardroom, but for our workers and for our communities, and we're fully leaned into that.
Well, I should respond to the snark, because the job of a journalist is to be fair.
Be fair.
To be fair, there was a cloud hanging over Biden. And to be fair, I started with the successes of the Biden administration. But my question was, will there be no more new climate laws over the next 2 years?
You know, I think that's yet to be seen. Just to go back in time, December 2020, I'm just giving you the best analogy I can, or contrast case rather, not analogy. December 2020, the United States Congress passed a bipartisan energy law that included funding for innovation on clean energy technologies. It passed the AIM Act, which actually allows us to set rules, and we have, to phase down hydrofluorocarbons. That was a Republican Congress, and a Republican president signed it.
Yeah, there was a Carbon Capture Act that was passed under Trump.
So, you know, I think it's possible, it's feasible, and we're trying to build the political economy for action. I'm not going to prejudge the next 2 years, but I'll say this: we've got momentum, we've got the leader, and we're going to keep trying to move forward.
Well, the reality is also that the division in the US in politics is growing on all fronts, but the climate division has been a very clear one for some time. And so if we look at the Inflation Reduction Act, which is going to be deployed and will require the support of Republican states for those deployments to actually happen, for all that money to be actually spent, we know that Republicans can act against their interest, as they are doing with ESG investments. They may do so with IRA just for spite. What are the bottlenecks, and how are you tackling those?
Well, one thing I think you do is to be very purposeful about pushing for a visible difference in as many communities in every zip code of the United States as possible. And I'll give you the example of our Climate Smart Agriculture program. So in September, we issued $2.8 billion to incentivize farmers to use climate smart agriculture practices. 50 states, all 50 states of the United States, 50,000 farms, 20 million acres, right? So I think that's part of how you deal with it, is to make sure that everybody is being benefiting from the upside. The second is we've got to engage with these governors. So the electric vehicle charging money I talked about, that money runs through the states. Not all of our states have Democratic governors. All 50 states submitted a plan to get the money. So it's a lot of shoe leather. We go through a lot of shoes to get this done, but we're going to keep hustling, and we're going to keep trying to bring people along. I think that, the skepticism is right, because it's informed by choices folks in elected office have made that I think are not representative of the best economic interests of their constituents. But to us, the economics are irresistible, and the more we talk about them, the harder it becomes for people to not be responsive to what's best for the American people.
Now, talking of communities and changing the political economy, you've made a commitment to Justice 40. This is the idea where 40% of the benefits from many of the federal climate and environmental programs will go to disadvantaged communities, and that's very welcome. It will change the political economy. But give me an example, a specific one, of how exactly it works.
That's a good question. And this is one that's really near and dear to my heart. I actually, before the Biden administration, went to the state of New York where they'd passed this legislation to do 35% of the benefits. And then I'm, talking to at the time, the candidate, Biden, and he says, well, let's go do 40. And now we're doing it. An example of that, we have a program through the Federal Energy Management Agency, FEMA. It's a newish program called BRIC, which is about building resilience into our communities. That program included Justice 40 as part of its criteria for putting dollars out. Multiple billions of dollars have moved out, and they have prioritized communities that are disadvantaged. One very specific grant that I think is illustrative is a wastewater facility in Jacksonville, Florida. It serves the sort of southern part of Georgia and northern part of Florida. And, this is like so many communities everybody knows, right? The lower lying areas are the places where lower income folks live. And as sea levels rise and the flooding increases over time, those facilities don't hold up. And people are absorbing literal filth because we fail to invest. BRIC, that grant, because of Justice 40, prioritizing them, is going to help them make that facility more resilient and adapt it to the changing climate. That's a big deal.
I would say, though, low-lying areas are also very attractive to rich people. Florida and its coast is a real good example.
I am a Miami Beach partisan, so I hear you.
Now, a lot of the talk at COP27 is about how countries can collaborate. But we live in a capitalistic...
Except on cricket.
Except on cricket. But we live in a capitalistic economy, and competition rules the world. Now, with the IRA, the US has made its biggest bet yet to build green technologies. But those industries have already been built in China. Not all of them, but most of them. Is the IRA a signal that the US is more now in competition than in collaboration with China? Because Secretary Kerry confirmed there are no conversations formally happening between US and China for collaboration anymore on climate.
Look, we talked about this during the years President Trump was in office, that the race in the clean energy economy doesn't choose its pace based on whether or not the United States is choosing to run hard. And so people have been competing on these technologies. And I think what's powerful now is we're investing in not only building the demand side of our market, right? We're not just deploying the wind turbines. In our tax code, we have also created a Section 45X, I know, really exciting name, to incent the manufacturing of those components in the United States. And if you want the full value of the deployment credit, you have to also get a bunch of the steel and the input materials from the United States. So, heck yeah, we're running to win. And that doesn't come, I think, at the exclusion of anybody. When I think about the president's climate agenda, one of the three core elements of it is this aspect of climate solutions, clean energy technologies made in America. And the way I think about it is, that's America leading by example, not by words. So let's have a race to the top.
The problem is the US is starting late. China, between around 2010 and 2018, spent $60 billion just on electric cars and batteries, only on one tiny sector of the decarbonization pie. China has a head start, at least a decade. How do you think the US will catch up?
You know, I'm pretty bullish on the United States, which is not unexpected. I taught graduate STEM students. We've got the brightest minds in our universities. Our national labs, Argonne National Lab, helped invent that technology.
China's making the money, though.
And now, but look at what's happening. Since the president took office, forget all of the stuff we've invested, $100 billion of private capital flowing in to make the stuff in America, right? Not just from US companies, foreign direct investment into the United States as well. So, you know, again,
one of those
you can bet against Biden, you can bet against America, but I feel pretty good that we've got a chance to really seize the leadership here and lift up workers and communities in the process.
One of those companies is called CATL. It is now the world's largest battery maker. It's Chinese. It is at the heart of German industry now. There's a big battery plant that they have in Germany, the home of automobile, supplying the very heart of the future transportation for electric cars, and it is looking to build a plant in North America, probably not in the US as we understand. But private capital can also come in from Chinese companies that are leading on this.
That's true, and you know what? Anyone who rests on today's technology is also probably in for an awakening at some point, right? You've got some of the incumbents, but you also got companies that are invested in the next generation beyond lithium ion, right? Companies like Form Energy that are now building fabs in the United States. So, you know, I think this is a dynamic market. We've got EV penetration, we've got momentum on it, but I think the lead will change a bunch of times. And again, we're running faster and faster.
Now, I'm enjoying this a lot. I'm going to go over a little bit, if that's okay. Now, domestic policies that we've talked about a bunch of times only become effective if the rules are in place. And one place where the Biden administration can be fairly criticized is that rulemaking has been slow. Things like setting standards for tailpipe emissions, for power plants, for methane. As we move into the second half of this term, is there a renewed focus on making rules? And how are you going to deal with the legal challenges that will inevitably come?
So many thoughts on this, but let me start with the day one of the Biden administration. On day one of the Biden administration, the president signed an executive order, said let's take on all of the regulatory rollbacks that had taken place in the administration prior, about 200 items to take on. We did that. He looked around the agencies that set these rules. A lot of them had been decimated in terms of human capital. Some of them had stopped collecting the data that you need to actually do the regulatory work. We've been doing the work of rebuilding that. And at the same time, we've set rules for hydrofluorocarbons. In the Obama administration, they set only standards for new sources of methane. We propose standards for existing sources of methane. Our fuel economy standards that we've finalized go further and faster than anything anyone's ever done before. So, and as I said, over 100 actions on energy efficiency through the Department of Energy on the regulatory side. And we've actually ventured on standard setting where no one ever expected us to. Our procurement agency has set standards for what it means to have clean asphalt, right? So, one, I think the president has made full use of the tools that he has available to him to push for action on the executive side. at the same time as he's passed the infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act. So if the question is, hey, you guys have been going really fast, really hard at trying to seize the full economic opportunity that climate change represents for the American people, are you going to keep running that fast? The answer is no, we're going to run faster.
All right. Now, we are at COP27, and we should talk about the questions being raised by developing countries here at COP27. And there is a domestic question that I want to ask you about it. Now, to give you context, yesterday it was announced that the US, through its Export-Import Bank, is giving Romania $3 billion towards its $9 billion of building 2 nuclear reactors. That sum is approximately the amount that the US gives in climate financing to developing countries. So when the US comes here and does not show more money, that's not really the case that there is no more money to be given. It's that there isn't the political will. Your job as a domestic national climate advisor is also to make sure that the president can have money from the Congress to live up to the $11 billion that he has promised. How are you going to make that happen?
Number one, I think it's us recognizing that we are in a shared challenge with folks all around the world, and that we must take all of this on together. And I think the place where we are succeeding in doing that, you know, going into Paris, something like 5-6 degrees. Coming into this administration, something like 3 degrees. Coming out of Glasgow, under 2 degrees. That's probably one of the best things we can do for the world and the future, is to make sure we actually follow through and deliver on that. Now,
the under 2 degrees is only possible if all the promises are met.
Absolutely.
And that is requiring the $11 billion at least, probably
Absolutely.
Closer to 40.
Yeah, and
share.
we want to go as fast as we can and try to get to 1.5 and have the accountability. And I think the major economies are going to play the major role in doing that, especially in this decade. But then it goes to the point of how do we advance the support on resilience and adaptation. The PREPARE program, which the president launched, 500 million people around the world benefiting. The first installment of investment into the adaptation fund, $100 million. The DFC, the Development Finance Corporation, just announced the set of deals that they've done in the last year, several $1 billion worth of clean energy deals, not just in the deployment side, but as I mentioned, in helping build up the manufacturing capability. But this is an ongoing effort for us, I think, to build political will and political economy around more ambitious climate action. And I'm hopeful that the conversations that are happening here in Sharm el-Sheikh, not only with the public sector, but also with the private sector, will help us redirect the capital flows that we need into taking this on.
But let's get real. The 2 bills where you did get Republican support for climate policy had some climate policy in them. They were not climate bills. You're going to need, for the appropriation to work, support from Congress, which is likely to be divided. How do you, and it's going to be a purely climate spending, which Republicans never sign up to. How can you make sure that money will come?
So, not to fact check you, but
Please do.
But the annual appropriations process, which is how Congress gives us cash, is has been subject in the last 2 years to needing Republican votes. In the final years of the Obama administration, subject to needing Republican votes. And there was an investment in supporting countries in boosting their resilience and adaptation, because I think there's a recognition that we've got a common fate and common destiny and common interests in terms of global security and global sustainability. So, again, we can try to sit here and forecast what's going to happen tomorrow and probably be unsuccessful. Certainly what happens over the next 2 years is subject to a lot of factors, but the president's commitment is clear. You'll hear him talk about it literally here tomorrow, so you don't have to take my word for it. But we're focused on being there as a partner and as an ally to those who seek to increase climate ambition in the direction of 1.5 degrees, those who seek to strengthen themselves through resilience and adaptation measures, and all in on that work.
Now, finally, I know you don't like to scoop your boss. He's coming tomorrow. But if you were writing Biden's speech, what would you say?
That's a funny one. What a hypothetical. Look, I think for the president, it's important for him to convey where all of this comes from, for him. I've been fortunate enough to sit on the plane with him, sit in the car with him, sit in the Oval with him, and hear and absorb his passion and where his focus on climate comes from, and it's totally in his core. That's why it's gotten the prioritization that it's gotten in this administration. I think that's a really important thing for everyone to understand and for them to hear. I think the second is for people to understand the progress we've made. The same folks who fed us denial and delay now want to feed us cynicism. They want to say that no matter how many people show up, no matter how many people push, no matter how many meetings we have and how many agreements we reach, that we won't make progress. But we are. And I think it's important for the President of the United States to share his perspective on that. And then the third is, there's a lot of talk about the headwinds to climate action these days, right? Energy security concerns around consumer costs. I think what we've discovered in the United States is that clean energy and the solutions around climate actually help us not only meet the moment on this environmental objective, but help consumers, help manufacturing, help our national security, help our energy security. That's a case I think he should make here and to all the leaders around the world. And I think if they hear that and they understand it, we will redouble our efforts collectively to move in the direction we need to.
Thank you, Ali Zaidi.
Thank you so much. And I'm on the podcast.
Yeah. So just like. And thank you to everyone in the audience. We are publishing new episodes of Zero every other day while we are here at COP27. And if you'd like to listen to those conversations, we interviewed the Prime Minister of the Bahamas. We interviewed the Prime Minister of Canada, Justin Trudeau. You can find them on Zero wherever you listen to podcasts. Thank you.
Great, thanks everyone. So it is time for lunch. You can join us for lunch outside. We've got lunch for about an hour. We do have our special session on data-centric climate strategy, which will feature Kate Brandt from Google and many others. That will start in here at 1 o'clock. And then our main stage programming will start back on here around 2 o'clock. We will be talking with the UN Youth Advisory Group. Thank you so much.